Hi friends, and welcome to All by My Shelf. I'm Miss Rachel, and it's so nice to see you. Today's panel is Like Agatha and Arthur, crafting a compelling mystery thriller. Our panelists today are June Herr, Adam Sass, Tom Ryan, Kylie Schachte, Meredith Tate, and Maggie Hall. If you're a Glenside patron, make sure you click the link marked Glenside in the description. That will take you to a page where it shows you all of the books that you're currently able to check out as ebooks, and gives you a form that you can fill out if you're looking for physical copies once the library reopens. You'll be able to put them on hold right then and there. I hope you enjoy this panel. So hi friends, welcome to our mystery thriller panel. I would like everyone to introduce themselves and a little bit about your book or your books. So Meredith, if you want to start.
Hi, my name is Meredith Tate. I live in Houston, Texas, and I have here The Last Confession of Autumn Casterly, which is my speculative allegorical murder mystery that came out in February. It is about two sisters, Ivy and Autumn, and they haven't spoken in 3 years. Autumn is a petty criminal and kind of a troublemaker, and Ivy is really nerdy and kind of afraid of her sister. And one day Autumn gets in over her head and she gets beaten up and left for dead and held hostage, and she doesn't know where she's being held. And her soul leaves her body as this ghost type thing. And as a ghost, she realizes she has 3 days to save herself before she dies. But as a ghost, nobody can see or hear her except for her sister Ivy. So that's this book, and it is also metaphorical about rape culture, because that's an issue that's really important to me. And then I also have my sci-fi thriller Freedom Trials, which came out 2 years ago. And it's basically about a girl in a juvie prison where prisoners' memories are wiped so they can't remember their crimes.
Awesome. Kylie.
Hey everyone, so I'm Kylie Schachte, and this is my debut novel, You're Next. So You're Next is about a 16-year-old detective named Flora Calhoun. When she was 14 years old, she had the really devastating incident of finding a classmate's body beaten and mutilated in the woods. Ever since has been really dedicated to fighting criminal justice and kind of taking on the cases that nobody else will take on. When her sort of ex, maybe not girlfriend is murdered, she knows that nobody else is going to get to the bottom of this, and it's really on her to find out who killed her ex-girlfriend Ava. The process of doing so, she uncovers this really vicious, deadly fight club that's destroying the lives of all the kids in her school and the surrounding town as well, and learning that everybody has secrets. And that's coming out in late June.
Hey, my name is Adam Sass, and my debut novel, Surrender Your Sons, comes out this September. Surrender Your Sons is, I call it Lost with Queer Kids. So it is, it follows Connor Major, who is taken to a conversion therapy camp on a deserted island. And there he teams up with the other queer LGBTQ campers who are there to take down the camp. They're not just going to escape, but there's also a crime that they discover has been covered up by this camp, a very, very old crime, a few decades old. And their thought is that they're not just going to escape, but they're going to make sure that nobody could ever come back here. So while they're planning their escape, they're also gathering evidence to get off the island about what has been committed, what is being covered up, and shut them down. It's a real, it's a mystery thriller, so it's more of an adventure story. There is, lots of cliffhangers, and definitely, but at the core of it is this very, very dark mystery.
Okay, June?
So my book is The Silence of Bones, and it's coming out in April. I almost forgot. April 21st. And it's it's set in Joseon Dynasty Korea, so specifically 1800s. And it's about a servant girl named Seol who is indentured to the police bureau. And she teams up with a well-respected young inspector with the investigation into the politically charged murder into a noblewoman. But there's more to the crime than meets the eye. Yeah.
Nice. And then Maggie.
Hi guys, I'm Maggie Hall. I have a trilogy out, and all of mine are out already. Looks like most of you guys are this year, but I have 3 books out already, and I forgot to bring the book in here, but I'm going to show you at least I think I am. There you go.
You're doing it.
It's called The Conspiracy of Us Trilogy, Conspiracy of Us, Map of Fates, and The Ends of the World. And all of those are out now. The books are about a girl that her long lost family is part of a powerful, dangerous secret society. And the parts of the society want her and parts of the society want her dead. So it's an international thriller, which means, like, I describe it as a Teen Da Vinci Code. They spend a lot of time running around the world, solving clues, going country to country. And she gets embroiled in, all these international politics and history going back to Alexander the Great, fitting in with this current society of people who rule the world. So mine's more of a thriller than specifically a mystery, but a mystery elements along the way.
Sure. So I'm Tom Ryan, and my most recent book is Keep This to Yourself, which was just nominated for a Thriller Award yesterday, which I'm very excited about. And it's a kind of a classic whodunit small town murder mystery about a small town called Camera Cove, which is sort of your stereotypical postcard pretty seaside town. And a year before the story begins, a serial killer came through the town, killed 4 people, and then disappeared. And police have thought all along that it was a drifter. Case isn't really solved, but it's over. There haven't been any more murders. And the main character, Mac Bell, is the story begins on the evening of his high school graduation. And he's kind of not closeted, but he's a very shy, insecure gay kid in this small town. And one of the victims of the murder spree from the year before was his best friend, his next door neighbor, Connor, who was sort of the golden boy of the town. And on the night of graduation, Mac finds a clue that indicates to him that when he died, Connor was actually on the case and had figured out who the killer was. And he wanted Mac's help, but Mac kind of missed that message. And so Mac is all the survivor's guilt and decides that he's going to start digging into the case on his own, and starts kind of going into the seedy underbelly of the town, and starts to realize that a lot of things in Camera Cove aren't quite what they seem. And so that came out last year, and it's available now, obviously. And I do mention very quickly, I have another mystery coming out this fall called I Hope You're Listening. And it's about a 17-year-old named Dee. She's a queer girl, also in a small town in the Midwest this time, and she has been struggling with survivor's guilt for the past 10 years because when she was a kid, her best friend was abducted when they were playing in the woods together, and she was the only witness, but she was unable to provide the police with any clues to help solve the case. And she's kind of struggled with this guilt for years. And to help come to terms with that, she starts a true crime podcast that is devoted to helping find missing people. And when the story begins, a small girl in their same small town has gone missing again. And so the two cases start to seem to have connections. And so kind of takes off from there. So that one's called I Hope You're Listening, and it's out in October.
Excellent. Okay, so what I really liked about putting this panel together was that everyone has sort of something a little bit different in their books. That's why it's a mystery thriller panel and not just one or the other. Adam, yours seems to be the most like thrillery, like adventure, like you said, rather than like a traditional like, I am a detective and I am here to solve a crime. Maggie, you've got a complete trilogy that spans the world, basically. Tom, you've got a book where like the murder's not actively happening. Like it's assumed that it's done. It's assumed that it's over. We've got a historical. We've got June's, which is set in the 1800. The speculative element in Meredith's. We've got Kylie, whose main character is investigating the death of a kind of ex. So can we talk a little bit about your initial inspirations for these books? Like what was the first spark of the idea? And did the original vision that you had for the book change as you were drafting it? Anyone can start.
Well, I'll just talk very briefly about my inspiration. I take my dog for a long walk every morning, and it's kind of where I get the juices, the creative juices flowing. And one day, about 4 years ago, I was out with my dog, and I had this image in my head of a group of teens digging up a time capsule. And I've started to kind of run this idea through my head and very quickly came up with the concept of these teens. They're digging up a time capsule on their high school graduation night. They buried when they were young. And they always said, we'll dig this up when we graduate high school. And so I thought, well, there's something here. Maybe this could be a kind of a contemporary story, which at that point, that's mostly what I had written, is kind of contemporary, straightforward YA. And then it just popped into my head that what if one of these kids was not there because they'd been murdered? And that just kind of struck me as sort of this bolt of lightning idea. And it opened up all these possibilities of this group trying to figure out what had happened to their friend, trying to solve their friend's murder. And from there, things really, it was one of those perfect scenarios where I had a premise for an idea and the pieces just really quickly fell into place. And I was able to see the end and write myself towards that, which doesn't happen all the time, that's for sure. So that's where my inspiration came from.
I'll go next. Surrender Your Sons literally has gone through 300 different versions. I mean, this was something that I started writing in 2013, and it was completely different. The only things that really remained were the core ideas of this kid Connor goes to this conversion camp island, and then he has a kind of a major revolution confrontation with the staff there, and there's an escape. The mystery element came in later. Actually, the core mystery that the whole book revolves around now, originally in the original version, was like a subplot. Like, so when I first wrote that, this was one of the first things I'd ever written, so I had like 70 subplots. And it was so complicated and genius, and it was just a mess. Like, so it was just so like 90% of that had to go. And then there was this one subplot that when I was querying agents and absolutely getting rejected, rightfully, one of the biggest like feedback was like there was a lot of interest in this subplot that had not it had been fleshed out, but it really was not the dominant thing. So, but that was sort of, that felt the closest to the vibe that these agents, and people that really, really wanted to, when they heard the pitch of the idea, really wanted the book to be about, and then it turned out to be all about this other stuff. So I took basically a year off and gutted it and rewrote it and really just focused on this one element and made it a mystery and kind of revolved everything around it. And it was a time where the chemistry experiment finally seemed to click and work, and everything kind of coalesced around this thing that there was this because it's this camp that, obviously, everybody is against and is doing these heinous things, but they're all nevertheless trapped there. And the idea that this sort of bad queer history from decades ago was coming back to haunt queer kids of today who, you know, are beyond a lot of what, you know, queer kids had to deal with in the 80s and 90s, but there were still these cycles of abuse and these repetitive cycles that these generations were trapped in, and that you know, the kids of today are still dealing with the ghosts of yesterday. And then that's a big theme in the book. So that definitely seemed to be the glue that finally kept the story all together.
I'll go next. So I also had 1,000 drafts before the actual book I published. The initial inspiration was, so I was, for like almost 8 years, I was querying another book. It was set in England. I was really into like Victorian era. But after like 1,000 rejections, I just kind of put that story aside. And I mostly gravitate towards historical fiction. So I wanted to write another historical, but I didn't want to write it in England because it just reminded me of all the rejections. And so, you know, I looked into different world histories, and then finally I was like, oh, like, you know, I'm Korean, so I might as well, you know, look into Korean history a bit, see what it's all about. I knew a bit of Korean history because I grew up with Korean parents and I lived in Korea for high school, but I kind of slept through history class then. But yeah, so I finally decided to read a bit into Korean history, and then I just fell in love with it. It was so fascinating, especially the role of the Tamo, which they were basically a group of women, and they were considered the first female police force in world history with arresting power, apparently. And so I decided to base my heroine on the role of Tamos. They were both servants and female police officers. But then initially my book wasn't a mystery. It was just like centered around this police woman. But it was more like a woman's fiction, like about her journey, searching for identity, making friends and all that stuff. But the first chapter began with mystery. And then my friend read my manuscript and she's like, I really loved the first chapter. Like, I was so curious about this murder mystery you opened up with. But then after chapter 1, it turns into like this story about a woman searching for her identity. And so she's like, oh, why don't you turn this into a mystery novel? And so I rewrote the book from scratch and turned it into a mystery. And yeah, that was the story behind my book.
So I can go. I had actually a bunch of different random pieces of inspiration for autumn. Kind of in the back of my mind, I knew I wanted to write a book based in my hometown of Concord, New Hampshire. I haven't lived there in about 8 years, but it's really important to me, and I always wanted to write a book set there. So that was in my head. And I knew I wanted to write about two sisters who didn't get along. So I kind of had those two separate pieces of information in my head bouncing around. And I kind of hit me. I was like, what if one of the sisters disappeared and the only person who could save her was the other sister, even though they were estranged and they didn't talk. So I had 2 chapters written on my computer for a while. I didn't really intend it as a mystery. I originally intended it more of just a contemporary sister story. And then in whatever year it was, I remember I was watching TV and there was a very bad, very public case. And it was about a man who was accused of sexual assault, and he got out with an egregiously light sentence, specifically due to the judge citing fear of harming his future career. And that really just kind of made me so viscerally angry that I was like, what do we need to do to kind of make this stop happening? And like, why isn't this a more of a thing? And I just got down, and I kind of hit me that I was like, I want this book to be about rape culture and to be about how damaging that is. And then I just started writing it. And from there, all those kind of factors came together, and I knew I wanted a character to be a ghost, and so it was just kind of a bunch of different things all coming together at once. And then it was still kind of a contemporary novel, and then my agent suggested some revisions to make it more of a thriller. I still think it's kind of more of a contemporary kind of feeling rather than a traditional thriller, but it's definitely now it's a more of a mystery. So
I can hop in here. So like I think a lot of people have said, my story has gone through like an uncountable number of revisions. Like almost every single element of the book has changed over time. The one thing that has been super consistent is the main character, Flora, and what she's all about. I actually got the initial idea for her while I was watching an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so my sort of like first spark of wanting to write this book was really about wanting to write an updated and contemporary version of this kind of traditional like ass-kicking heroine. At the same time, I think a big political question that's been on my mind, and I know on the mind of a lot of people, especially in the last 10 years or so, has been really about criminal justice and who gets justice and who doesn't, who we consider an acceptable victim, things like that. And I just felt like a 16-year-old girl, somebody who we inherently view as being weak and vulnerable, might have a really interesting perspective to bring to that. I think as I wrote it, and I had this idea for this teen detective, that idea of playing between like the ass kicker versus this sort of soft and vulnerable teenage girl became even more centrally important to writing it. I think Flora is somebody who at 16 has witnessed the sort of unspeakable horrors of the world. She says at one point that she feels like the veil of the world has been pulled away, and she's seen horrors that the real like truth of the horrors of the world that nobody else has witnessed. And she's just sort of walking around alone with that knowledge. And so she retreats into this kind of like trope of being the ass kicker, of being the badass, as this kind of mask that she puts on to avoid dealing with her trauma. What she learns over the course of the book is the more she leans into the softer and more vulnerable, more empathetic and more compassionate pieces of herself, the better she's able to actually achieve justice and find truth in the world. And you can't turn away from your grief and from your trauma forever. So go to therapy, everybody.
All right, I think I am the last one. Okay. Well, like everybody, it seems like my books, especially the first one of the trilogy, went through about 1,000 iterations. Like many of you, it was my first book, and I really didn't know what I was doing when I first wrote it. I just had a fun idea about a group who ruled the world and a girl who was part of them somehow. And I knew I wanted to do it like an international thriller, going place to place, solving clues, running away from bad guys, lots of car chases and getting shot at, and romance and all that stuff. But the problem with that was, when I started writing that's not a plot, it turns out. So it's really interesting that you asked this question on a mystery panel, actually, because I think that mystery is a really good way to put a plot into a book that doesn't necessarily have one, or that doesn't have one in the right kind of stacked order that you need to get from here to there and for everything to make sense. And so leaning into that during my revision process is one of the things that I think actually got me from mass of ideas on paper to a story that actually progresses from point A to point B to finally figuring out what's going on. So yeah, I definitely changed a lot about the book over time, and especially in this way of my characters started leaning into not just I'm a teenage girl who's part of this huge thing, what do I do about that, but going from different like mystery to mystery, like who is my family, who her mom gets kidnapped at some point, so she's going after that, and that's a big driver, and then someone else important to her, something else happens. It's a few people have said that it's something that kind of came in during their revision process, and that's interesting that happened to me too. So I think, Rachel, that was a really cool question, because I hadn't really thought about it like that, actually.
Okay, so we're doing this question, the whole panel is going to be as spoiler-free as possible, but especially this question, but it's always something I'm curious, is, did you know the resolution of the mystery thriller arc from the time that you started it? Like, I know you didn't all necessarily start with your books as mysteries, But when it turned into one, like, did you always know like who the bad guy was? Did you always know sort of that resolution? And Maggie, I'm gonna have you start because you were the last one last time, and because I have an extra little question for you that I didn't include on there, because you not only have the mystery arc, but you've got it across 3 books, so you have like a trilogy arc.
Yeah.
And you also have a love triangle arc. So did you know the resolution to the love triangle as well?
Ooh, that's a juicy question. So with all of those, I had an idea, both about the full trilogy and book to book, but a lot of things changed in between, I would say. So just for the mystery thriller arc, kind of what happens at the end, who's behind everything, all that, I kind of knew from the beginning generally where I wanted it to go. But up till the end, I was changing pieces of it, if that makes sense, without going into too much detail. And that definitely happened to book to book. You know, before I had sold the trilogy, I had written the first book, but only had synopses for the next 2. But then I did a ton of revision with my editor for the first book, so that necessarily changed what happened in book 2 and 3. So that just kind of progressed on and on in that way. And in terms of the love triangle arc, I actually shockingly did not know how it was going to turn out. Probably about halfway through book 2. So without saying much more than that, I let my character direct it, and it turned out in not the way I thought it was going to when I first started writing the series. So
for me, when I was drafting the mystery version of my book, I had no idea who the killer was. Like, I had an inkling, like, oh, maybe this person's the killer. And so basically throughout the draft, I was just writing my way to figuring out who the killer was. And then every draft, the killer kept changing. And so I think that's why people say that all the characters are very suspicious, because I suspected everyone. But yeah, I had no idea. And so I think I had a vague idea of how I wanted the mystery arc to go, because I usually use mystery to explore history. But I was always changing my mind as to like who the killer was, because for me, like, motivation is so important. And so as I wrote, like, the motivation for each character kept becoming more complicated. And then as things got more complicated, like, I felt like this person might have more reasons to kill than that person. And so yeah, I had no idea when I began writing.
So with Keep This to Yourself, it's very twisty, and I feel very fortunate that I started off, as I think I mentioned, that it was a group of 4, it was 5 friends originally who opened this time capsule. And the premise when it was at first going to be just kind of a straightforward contemporary, my idea was that it would be 5 friends who used to be really tight. They were all neighbors. And by the time they open up this time capsule, they're 18, it's high school graduation, they've all drifted apart. And so that was going to be the drama, was why are they no longer friends? And then I had this idea that one of them is dead, and so it became a mystery. That all happened really quickly. And then because I had never written a mystery before, but I read a lot of mysteries, it was sort of a learning process for me. And I started thinking, well, maybe I'll plot it out, and while I'm plotting it, I will make my way towards a resolution, because I just didn't really know how I was supposed to figure out who had done it. I just had never done this before. But fortunately for me, I very quickly in that process had a moment of inspiration that told me who the killer was. So I was very early on in the drafting phase, and I had a very specific end to work towards. And so at that point, what I was able to do was I had to obviously make it convincing and work my way to the end of the book without giving out too many clues, but dropping just enough breadcrumbs that an astute reader could pick up on them. But I also, that gave me the advantage of being able to very strategically try to make most of the other, if not all of the other main characters in the book suspicious in one way or another. So I feel like it was a writerly gift to have been given that inspiration to know who the murderer was, because once that big, huge question was answered for me, I was able to play a lot of games in the writing where I was doing a lot of, the traditional red herrings and wild goose chases and all that kind of stuff, so that the reader would be kind of thrown off track just enough. But when you finish the book, what you want as a mystery reader is you want to get to the end and be surprised, or even better, to figure it out right before the end, so you feel that much smarter than the writer, but at the same time be able to look back and say, oh, that's what was happening all along. And so it was fun to write towards something that was, a relative, I don't want to spoil, but it's kind of a big reveal at the end. And it was for me, just writing a mystery was a lot of fun. I love it. I'm going to write mysteries for the rest of my life now, because I think it's, as I think Maggie, it was you who said that, it's a mystery is a great way to take a milieu, a bunch of characters, and to press a format of a plot down into that. And so every mystery is kind of a little logic puzzle. And for me, half the fun was figuring it out, and half the fun was knowing more than the reader did.
So as I said, Autumn started out as a contemporary story with a little bit of a mystery. And originally, in the first kind of drafts of it, it wasn't a mystery who the murderer was, because when Autumn is being beaten up in this warehouse, she saw who it was, she knew who it was, and she starts to talk to them. And the real mystery came with her trying to communicate to her sister who knows nothing about her life, would have no idea who these people were that took her. So it was about her trying to, in this ghost form, trying to communicate to her sister, like, you need to look for me, you need to find me. Because it's not like she says to Ivy, go look in that car, and Ivy says, I better go look in that car. She's ripping her hair out saying, Ivy, car, and Ivy's kind of sensing. She's like, I feel like I need to look in the car. So it's a lot of kind of mentally her trying to connect to her sister. And in the subsequent drafts, when we started to make it more of a thriller, my agent said, what if we don't have her know who it is right up front? What if Autumn doesn't know who took her? So we took that part out completely and dropped in a lot of other red herrings. We took a lot of other side characters and tried to make them kind of more suspicious throughout the book. So it kind of became more of a whodunit murder mystery, when originally it wasn't as much. I think it works a lot better this way. So
similar to Meredith, mine was sort of, I always knew who done it, because it was this part of this previous version, and that didn't change. But really, the mystery in Surrender Your Sons is a little like deconstructed, because there is a mystery of like who had done it, but it becomes really more of a crisis of who will care once we find out, because all of these kids are completely isolated on an island with a staff of, they're all villains. So it's like there's a killer amongst the rest of this garbage. So it's like once you find out, who's going to care? And there becomes a real crisis of like, even if we find out, even if we get the evidence, even if we escape, our families sent us here. So who do we tell? Like, it just becomes this like further and further out there thing. And this really kind of coalesced around after the election, where it became this crisis of like, well, what happens when everybody goes, that person did it, this bad thing, and then it's just like, great, did someone go to jail? Like, it just is like, it becomes a real existential thing, where it was basically how I was feeling about all of this, about like, what do you do when you know exactly who did, when you know exactly what this person deserves, but is somebody going to be brought to justice? Will that even go there? What evidence will be enough? I mean, to a parent who would send their kid to this position, would any evidence be enough, or would they never take that child's word for anything? So that really becomes like a lot of the driving force, way more than even like who it is. It becomes almost secondary. And the thing that is about Surrender Your Sons is that it's really how I imagined it as like the Matthew Shepard murder if the killer had never been discovered. If it was just this horrible thing that had just affected everybody in the country, and then it was just this completely open wound, nobody ever solved it. And it was that sort of thing where it was like, well, it's not necessarily bringing them to justice that will really close that loop. What will close that loop? And so that's really what that's always been about. So it's really been more about all the different, like, you know, so I did know who it was, but what always was changing was what would happen to them. Who would go to jail, who wouldn't survive, who I would forgive. That changed the most. Was there was a version of this book that was a lot more generous to a lot of the bad characters, and as time went on, it got less, way less generous. So that definitely had gone back and forth. And so I think eventually found the right mix there of satisfaction for the reader.
I think I'm the last one. So I had never written a book all the way through to the end until I wrote You're Next. So I was basically learning how to write a book while I was writing it. So probably comes as no surprise that I had literally no idea who the killer was. And in fact, who the killer ends up being has changed over the course of several drafts. So the first probably like 1,000 drafts that I did had somebody very different in that role. And then somebody made a suggestion about who the killer might be instead. I think without spoiling anything, I'll just say that making that change, you know, a lot of the set piece scenes, like the big climactic reveal, actually stayed more or less the same in terms of the logistics of it, even after I switched out who the killer was. But made it a lot more personal and a lot more intimate for Flora, the main character, to have the killer be this new person instead. So the change is really about making it more into this much more gutting and emotional reveal at the end of all of it.
Nice. So are there any mystery thrillers? They don't necessarily have to be books. They don't even necessarily need to be YA if you stick fully to books. Mystery thrillers that have kept you on the edge of your seat, that have given you that thrill, like Tom said, of solving it like half a second before it guides you to the correct answer. Stuff like that. Anyone can go first.
So I would say, first of all, a recent thriller that is absolutely, maybe just go like this, is Tom's Keep This to Yourself. I was on a flight, and it was one of those things where you get to like the 3/4 mark, like the 85% mark, and you're just like, I got it, I solved it, figured it out, cracked the code, and then like the real ending comes and you're just even more just like floored. It was one of those things where like I'm normally able to figure it out. I watch a lot of Poirot, I read a lot of Agatha Christie, and it was like I'm able to kind of suss it, but no, Tom, definitely Keep This to Yourself, highly recommend, because you don't see it coming. And then specifically for Surrender Your Sons, I definitely owe a lot to And Then There Were None, which is classic. But that was I one of my favorite times, read it multiple times, but one of my favorite times reading is I was on vacation and I was at this ski lodge, and the power had gone out, so it was all dark, and I was like just reading this by literally flashlight in bed, and it was, and because it's different than other Agatha Christie books in that there's this just very powerful dread of they're not just isolated there, and there's not just like a killer picking them off. It's also, there's all these secrets, and there's all this, you just really get this just powerful feeling that just something very bad is happening beyond just a murder or crime. And that's something that I definitely wanted to permeate Surrender Your Sons, was that they're all isolated it can only be so many people. We all know everybody who's there. But that, like, the closer you got to the ending, the further deeper into the mystery you got, the more just powerful feeling you have of just like, whatever this is, it's really terrible.
So I have to say that it's not quite a murder, like a traditional murder mystery, but Sadie by Courtney Summers is like the book that instantly or simultaneously was like so mad that I hadn't thought of the idea, but also was so glad that Courtney Summers wrote it, because like never would I have been able to do that concept justice. But I thought just the way the execution of that book, so for those who haven't read it, it's told through dual perspective between a girl whose 13-year-old sister, who she's the primary caregiver for, has been murdered, and set in the future, like a short ways in the future from that perspective, is a podcast host who is piecing out the story of these two girls and the crimes that were committed now that the older one has gone missing as well. And so you're hearing the events of the story happen first person from Sadie herself, and then hearing the podcast interpretation of it at the same time. And the execution of it is just so brilliant and genius. Like, my jaw was on the floor the whole time. And it's like such a grim story that I think holds this really unflinching lens up to like true crime and podcasts, and the way that we consume and are entertained by these really horrifying stories at the same time that there are like very human people and grief behind all of this stuff as well. So just like flawlessly done. On a much lighter note, I think for TV, American Vandal, both seasons are like perfectly executed mysteries. They are parodies of true crime, and are like possibly some of the funniest depictions of Gen Z I've ever seen, and like most accurate depictions of Gen Z I've seen on TV, but like perfectly executed mysteries in addition to that.
I can go. I'm a big fan of Kara Thomas's books. Those are kind of more of traditional YA mysteries, YA thrillers. And they are both, the two that I've read The Darkest Corners and I've read The Cheerleaders. Both of them threw me. I'm a very good guesser, and both of them threw me. I read both on vacation and could not put them down. So if you're into like traditional YA thrillers, definitely check her out. And I was also going to say Sadie. I loved Sadie. That's a great book, great recommendation, and definitely think everyone should check it out.
I'll jump in because I also read Sadie and I loved it. I didn't read it. I listened to the audiobook version of it, and it made the whole podcast POV so much realer, and it was so cool. My recommendation would be a Korean drama called Signal, but it's based on this case that, kind of like Adam Sass mentioned, like this wound that affected the whole nation, where like women were going missing and they were found murdered in really gruesome ways, and it ended up turning into a cold case. So what the series is about is when like the modern day police force, this one police officer finds a way to connect with the past group of detectives working on what would turn into a cold case. And it was just like one of the most, like, I was like on the edge of my seat, cold sweat. It was so amazing, and also so it like, you know, also made the mystery so emotional as well. And another series that I learned a lot from was obviously like books by Tana French. She's like an amazing mystery author, and the way she writes the mystery is so complex, and I feel like there's so much that I learned from as a mystery author about just like the importance of like testimonials and stuff. So like when I was writing my mystery, I was basically like reading Tana French and trying to figure out like, you know, how does she you know, dig into the truth and things like that. So yeah.
June, I'm sorry, what was that?
Tana French.
But the one before that, was it Signal?
It's so good. You have to watch it.
Will do.
Do you want to go? Or
Sure, I'll go. I'll rhyme through. I have a bunch of books. I'll rhyme through them really quickly. Tana French, if you haven't read Tana French and you're a mystery fan, get on Tana French. She's so good. And I don't think anybody out there writing mysteries is doing as good a job of marrying the kind of emotional, psychological stakes with the actual, just really well-crafted mystery thriller. She's amazing. Everything that she writes, that just completely blows my mind. A book that I love that isn't necessarily, I don't know if it's a mystery thriller per se, but it has one of the most incredible twists I've ever read, is Fingersmith by Sarah Waters. And it's also, she's an iconic writer in the queer canon, in my opinion. I just finished The Sundown Motel, which is amazing. It's kind of a commercial set in the 80s and the present day, and it's kind of a back and forth mystery with a bit of a supernatural twist. And I really, really loved it. I thought it was great. And and also Surrender Your Sons by Adam, which I was fortunate enough to read early, and it's not just a really great, exciting adventure thriller, but it's a very important book. It does some stuff with trauma that I don't think anybody else is doing in YA, and I think it's going to be a big release this year.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, a lot of you guys have mentioned books I'm going to mention. Sadie, Kara Thomas, Tana French. And I also have something with a little bit different on my list. I've always liked Maureen Johnson's mysteries. She Truly Deus is the series. I really liked The Name of the Star, which the series was called Shades of London. That's what it was called. I think it's not quite such a traditional mystery always, like they are, but I feel like not quite as much as some of these, but she's really good at atmosphere, I feel like, which is one of the things that I find really pulls me along in a story. Like if I find myself wanting to go back to this world and go along with the characters and see what's going to happen to them, like in addition to the great twists, that's really something that gets me, and I think she is really good at that.
Truly Devious is really, really good too.
I was gonna say, Tom and I were talking about Maureen Johnson before most folks were on the call, so that's really great. So one of the things I really wanted to talk about was settings. Because while, I mean, obviously every book has a setting, they can be super integral to mystery thrillers. And a lot of these either are like smallish towns, or like we've got Maggie's that's like international. So we've got like this whole sort of range. And I just wanted to talk about how you guys came up with where you wanted to set your books, and how that influenced the story you were telling.
Mine, as Rachel said, my books are set all over the world. I don't really have one specific setting, but the setting of them being international, being set all over the world, especially from an American point of view, she's a small town girl who's never been out of the country, and that absolutely is extremely important. My character being a fish out of water in all these places, first of all, not knowing where she is, what she's doing, going from place to place, it's all real disorienting, besides that, that the settings are part of the story. And that's another thing that I wanted to do with the books too, is that I love travel and I wanted to put in a bunch of cool places. So that's fun too. But yeah, absolutely, it could not have been the same story, set in one town somewhere.
Oh, go ahead.
No, it's fine.
So when I was 13, so right before 9th grade in high school, I moved from LA to a very small town in Connecticut, where everybody that I went to high school with had been in school together since they were in like pre-K. And it had this really claustrophobic feeling to it of like everybody knows each other's secrets, or everybody thinks that they know each other's secrets. But at the same time, there's this sort of like simmering toxic waste lurking underneath everything. And I think that was really integral to the setting of my book, of You're Next. You know, Flora goes to this high school where everybody's on top of each other all the time, and she thinks she knows everybody's business, and everybody's always in her business. And yet there's this huge revelation that there's this fight club that is, you know, tearing her entire community apart that she didn't even know about. Despite the fact that she is easily the nosiest person in her school. I think as far as the Fight Club goes, you know, when I was first writing drafts of this book, it was kind of just like this one cool scene that I wrote for like fun and to introduce this sort of like sexy, broody fighter character that plays a pretty important role in the story, but that was really it. I went through Pitch Wars in 2017, and when I was going through revisions for that, which is a mentorship program where you work with a mentor to revise your book. When I was going through that, my mentor suggested like, hey, that Fight Club scene, like what if that was basically the entire book instead? And that is how that became like such an integral setting to the story. And I think that there's so much, you know, as ludicrous as it seems and as sort of out of this world as it seems, there's so much to play with there in terms of, you know, the violence and the tensions that are simmering under the surface within her small town.
So my book, actually, the setting is probably more important to me than it is to the overall plot, which is its place in my hometown, takes place in Concord, New Hampshire. I don't think anything about the setting itself necessarily is integral to the murder mystery, but I definitely think the setting is integral to who my characters are as people, kind of their history, like who they became. Because again, I grew up there, and I think I put a lot of that in there. There are lots of real Concord restaurants. There's streets that are real. Basically, all the places in the book are real places that are important to me, and they're also important to Ivy and Autumn in different ways too. And I also think that it kind of, you know, I'm a New England girl at heart, and so are my characters. They drink Polar Seltzer and Dunkin' Donuts, and I had a lot of fun kind of exploring that. Because when I was in high school, you know, my friends, we didn't have anything to do in the evening, so we would go to Walmart and walk around and prank each other, and that's kind of what my characters do too in a small town setting. So I kind of wanted to bring that up, even though the murder itself could have probably happened anywhere. I like to think that my characters are kind of part of the town that they're in.
What inspired my book was history, and I was focusing on Korea when it was a closed-door kingdom, so they wanted nothing to do with the West, and there was this, so my book focused on that tension, the mystery focused on that tension between traditional Korea and the West, and the heart of that tension centered in the capital of Korea, which is Seoul now, but back then it was called Hanyang. And so that's where the mystery takes place. And so the setting was definitely integral to the story. And so my heroine, Sol, she comes from a small village, and then she's kind of forced to work for the police bureau, which is like this, you know, huge place in a huge capital. Back then it would have been a city as it is now. And yeah, I just like the idea of like her having to not only, you know, figure out a murder mystery, but also try to like explore the mystery of the setting that she's been thrown into as well. So yeah, setting was definitely an integral part for my book.
Adam, do you want to go? Or do you want me to go?
Sure. Setting is obviously this tropical island, which is very, very important. It was aesthetically important for me because I knew I'd be dealing with, as Tom mentioned, a whole bunch of trauma and a whole bunch of really dark stuff that a lot of readers, not just young readers, would, you know, it's heavy. And a lot of books that have been written about conversion therapy tend to be in sort of very gray, mundane spaces. And I wanted to just basically do the opposite of that, because I really, at the end of it, I wanted this to be a tough story that was ultimately dressed up as an adventure. I don't want to say a fun adventure, but it's definitely something that is very physical, because I knew I would be bringing these kids into an environment that was very culture shock, and would be something that they would all be, you know, it would be rainy, it would be dirty, it would be muddy, it would be like an untamed jungle. So there would be, there's none of them would be in their comfort zone. None of them would be in anything familiar. And there is this Lord of the Flies feeling that kind of permeates the story, where it's, we begin with all of these, very sweet queer kids who are ultimately brought to this breaking point where it does have to get a little dirty, has to get a little nasty. So on one hand, there's this very sweeping, dramatic, romantic island sort of thing, because there are relationships, there is romance in the book. There's a lot of sweeping adventure stuff. There's lots of stuff to offset the darkness. But at the end of it, the story definitely had to happen this way. And it wasn't just completely out of my head. There was a lot of what inspired Surrender Your Sons is a documentary from 2014 called Kidnapped for Christ. You can find it on Showtime, I think. And it was based in a real conversion therapy camp that existed in the Dominican Republic. And this, it's closed now, but this was really an expose piece. And it was not just queer kids that were taken there. It was called a dumping ground for wealthy evangelicals. It was if the kid was involved with anything in the law or with substance use, like it was really just a big reform place. And they were taken from their homes and transported out of the country and then taken to this very isolated island. And it was such an unreal feeling, and that struck me more than anything, is that it made the story, by making the what they were going through, it made those emotions so much bigger. Because I think when I tend to read about conversion therapy, and it's more in these more mundane strip mall places, there's a challenge to make the emotions of what they're going to feel as extreme as what the characters feel. And definitely I felt that in this documentary, and that's what I wanted people to feel in this, was that maybe necessarily since so much of it is an internal strife that they're going through, that by physicalizing it in this way, readers would feel it more.
So I grew up in a very small, very remote island community in Nova Scotia, and there were fewer than 2,000 people in my town. And my family's still there. I go all the time. And it's a very beautiful part of the world, coastal cliffs and caves and beaches and hills. It's a great place to grow up, but it's also got all that isolated small town stuff that Kylie was talking about. People who have known each other, not just since kindergarten, but multiple generations of people, lots of secrets, lots of family intrigue. And so that sort of milieu made sense for me. And it also lent itself, I think, really well to keep this to yourself, which needs to be in sort of a claustrophobic small town environment. The fact that these murders all took place in a small town and everybody knew the victims and everybody was impacted, and the main character is clearly grieving, but the whole town is still grieving and trying to come to terms with this awful, traumatic series of murders. And so it made sense for me, because that's I often say, as a writer, I feel really fortunate that I grew up in a small town like that, because I really do instinctively understand the layers of connection between people from that kind of particular perspective. And in a mystery where you're trying to kind of unveil and roll out secrets, those instincts really served me well, I think. And it was just really fun to write a foggy hurricane, the hurricane coming at the end of the story, and beaches and sea caves. One of the murders happens in a sea cave, and it was a fun space to write about. It was a fun kind of atmospheric part of the world to write about. Although my publisher asked me to change it to Maine, and I said, sure, write those checks. I'll put it wherever you want. So in my heart, it's Nova Scotia, but in the book, it's in Maine.
It's definitely very Cabot Cove, Murder, She Wrote, right?
Yeah. The best review anybody gave me was, it's like a gay teen Jessica Fletcher in Murder, She Wrote, which, I mean, no higher praise.
Okay, so I sent y'all the very basic version of this question because I wanted the actual like scenario part to be a surprise. So the part I sent you was, do you think you would survive a murder mystery? But the murder mystery itself. So we're saying you're investigating a murder, okay? And the killer is onto you. You have just found out that they're onto you. So do you survive and solve the mystery and everything's great? Do you get caught by the killer? Do you get spooked immediately and turn all information you have over to the police and then hide your closet? Or do you go on vacation and pretend you don't know anything?
I would get spooked and go to the cops personally.
Yeah.
I'm easily scared. I'm scared of everything. So right to the Mounties, as we say in Canada.
That would probably have been my first thing I did. I'd probably just call the police and then get scared and go hide in a closet somewhere.
I feel like I'm always yelling at people on TV to do that. So that's probably what I do, you know, even though we all write books where they did not do that, like in real life, yeah. Let the cops deal with it.
I'll add a twist to that where I will say I would take what I've learned so far, make copies, mail them to several different people and the cops, confront and be like, this already went out. And then have my Fletcher moment where I'd be like, where they're going to be like, oh, and now I silence you. And then I just go, oh, now is the time where the sheriff walks in. So yeah, I would try to my best to orchestrate that. Probably get in the process there, be too clever, but.
I too am afraid of literally everything. But I like Adam's twist to it. I think not only mailing multiple copies of everything I've accumulated thus far to other people, but I also think the press. I think a big part of this sort of like underlying tension in my book is that like she fundamentally just doesn't trust the cops to do anything about it. And I think, you know, especially as like a privileged white woman, I've had to really confront recently how much like the cops don't necessarily care an equal amount of getting justice for everybody. So I think using what I had already gathered to drum up interest and sort of force people to pay attention would be my other kind of more Ravenclaw answer to murder problem. Unlike my character who's a dumbass Gryffindor and would just kind of like jump in with both feet without looking.
I just find it so funny that a lot of, not all mystery writers, but a lot of mystery writers are actually like really terrified of everything in real life. But they write the most terrifying books.
I just was on a podcast talking about this, but it's like horror and mystery and thriller and suspense. They're sort of my way of like validating my most anxious thoughts. I'm like, because I just game out all the different scenarios of like how things could go wrong, and I'm like, oh, this go this way, this go this way, and if I just like play it out, you know, write these stories where it's like the worst possible thing happens, or oh my gosh, you know, they didn't make it if they had only done this. Yeah, it feels like a very long game way of confirming my anxieties to expel them.
I agree.
I always joke about how if I was in any of my main character's shoes, I would have been killed by like chapter 3. So
That's me. That's absolutely me.
Yeah, that's something where in Surrender Your Sins, so Connor Major, my main character, is like me, is very mouthy, and like even in like the worst, he's like in the most, like he's in so much trouble, and it's just the whole camp is run by a bunch of Professor Umbridges, and he just like can't stop his mouth, and again, it just keeps unfolding from there. So that's kind of how I was like, oh, this is what would happen to me. I would not be able to stop making a snarky comment, and then just escalate so quickly.
Yeah, would for sure annoy the murderer into killing me just to make me stop talking and mouthing off.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining in this panel. If we can sort of go down the non-existent line because we're all on computers, and just reiterate who you are, what your books are, and where people can find you on social media, that would be great. Anybody can start. Maybe Tom, because I skipped him at the first time.
Okay, I'm Tom Ryan, and the book I talked about most today was Keep This to Yourself. And my next book is called I Hope You're Listening. And there will be a cover reveal sometime over on my social media. I'm doing a Bookstagram reveal. I'm working that out with someone for next week. And so you can find me I'm at Tom Ryan, author, everywhere. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. So yeah, come say hi.
I'm Meredith Tate. Last Confession of Autumn Casterly is my contemporary murder mystery, and then Freedom Trial is my sci-fi thriller. Both are very different mysteries. Yeah, come say hi on social media. I'm on Facebook, Meredith Tate Author. I'm on Twitter at MLTate24, and I'm on Instagram at MeredithLTate24 because I originally made MLTate24 and I got locked out and it would not let me log in, so I had to make a new one. So I'm not on there at the same handle as my Twitter handle.
I'll go. I'm Kylie Schachte. This is my debut novel, You're Next. It's coming out in late June. And you can find me on social media. I have the same handle everywhere. It's at Kylie Schachte. I would type like whatever your best guess is at spelling my last name into Google and let it kind of autocorrect that for you. And there's a Goodreads giveaway for my book going on right now until April 23rd, I want to say. So if you want to win potentially one of 10 arcs for Your Next, that's happening right now.
I'm Maggie Hall. I don't have my book here again, but there's, there you go. There's the cover. Conspiracy of Us trilogy, Conspiracy of Us, Map of Fates, and The Ends of the World. All three of them are out now. And you can find me on social media, Maggie E. Hall. And I'm never on Twitter, but on Instagram sometimes.
Hi, I'm June Her, and my book, The Silence of Bones, is out April 21st, and you can find me on Twitter at writer June Her, and also on Instagram at June H Writes.
And I'm Adam Sass. My debut novel, Surrender Your Sons, comes out September 15th. And you can find me on Twitter at The Adam Sass, on Instagram at It's Adam Sass. And then if you can request Surrender Your Sons an e-arc on NetGalley right now. And you can also find I'm doing a 9-part prequel installment for one of the side characters in my book that is happening monthly on my website, adamsassbooks.com, where you can subscribe. The 4 parts are already live, and I'll be releasing one every month up until the release.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you, Rachel.